Hello, everyone. This is Ken Willett. I serve as the Executive Director of the North American Fire Training Directors, and I'm pleased today to be facilitating a roundtable discussion on the implementing standards in rescue training. And I want to thank the National Volunteer Fire Council for hosting this and for inviting me to be part of this today. Um, Today, the ever changing landscape that the volunteer and the entire fire service faces regarding occupational safety and emergency preparedness and ensuring that those who are doing rescue team functions and duties are properly prepared has become more complex. We have NFPA standards, we have OSHA standards, we have department training, we have state teams, we have local teams, we have regional teams, we have urban search and rescue teams, and they're all out there doing it. So the landscape can be a little confusing, and what it takes to be able to navigate through that can be just as confusing. But today, we have a panel that brings a broad perspective to the discussion. We have Kevin Reardon, the State Fire Marshal for Ohio. We have Kevin Shea, retired from FDNY, who is well known for his expertise in rescue. And we have David Rhodes, the editor of Fire Engineering and also the host of the Fire Department Instructors Conference that's going to be coming up in a very short period. And we're going to have a conversation to get their perspective on navigating this landscape with a focus on training to standards in rescue qualifications for the volunteer fire service. There's some elements of this that we're going to talk about: curriculum development, standards making organizations, professional readiness, leadership. What do the OSHA regulations look like? What do departments need to do this? What's the best practice? What's the not so best practice? So, all of this information we hope to share with you today. Our format is we'll be having a conversation. And if you have a question, please feel free to use the chat function to post the question. And if it's directed to a specific panel member, would you just preface that, please? And then Maggie from NVFC is helping monitor those, and we'll be sure that I see those questions so that we can answer them before the roundtable is done today. We're happy that you're here, and I'd like to now, before I get to the introduction of our panel, Maggie, would you put up the first poll, please? So we're going to ask the participants on the roundtable today to take this simple poll, and it's asking you um, what level of training when it comes to technical rescue, and that could be any type of technical rescue, not just technical rescue, vehicle extrication, water rescue, confined space, trench, you name it. Do you view your level at? Are you at an awareness level, meaning, oh, I know a little bit about it, but more importantly, I know who to call? Are you at an operations level where perhaps you've been trained to a higher level and you can do some independent operations? Or are you a technician where you've taken a lot of training and you're part of a team or you can direct a team? Or are you other? You're not quite sure where you fit, but you've got some training, but you're in that category. So if you would please take a quick minute just to answer that quick poll. And while we're doing that, I'd like to introduce the members of our panel and ask each member to give a brief introduction and their interest in the topic today. And then when we're completed with the introductions, we're going to start with our conversation. So first, I'd like to ask Kevin Reardon, the State Fire Marshal for Ohio, to provide an introduction and his interest in this topic today. Kevin?
Sure. My name is Kevin Reardon. I'm the State Fire Marshal for Ohio. My interest in this project stems across a lot of different areas, but it all comes back to how do we make the fire service for volunteers work better? Every state has the same problems with recruitment, retention, training, on and on and on. But we're at a point in Ohio with our 1,180 fire departments. Some of the volunteer departments I know are going to start to go away. So when we talk about adding training standards and things to volunteers, it's a different discussion than it is for full-time career folks. So that's my interest in how we can bring the same level of training to them in a different way, perhaps, and help them better themselves, better their community.
Okay. And next, David Rhodes, would you do a quick introduction and your interest in the topic today, please?
Sure. David Rhodes, 38 years now in the fire service. I retired as a battalion chief out of the city of Atlanta, Georgia, fire department. And I did serve as our special ops chief for several years. and also was a task force leader on our state USAR team. Been instructor in technical rescue at FDIC, and also worked for a few private companies that did technical rescue training for industry and for fire departments. So been involved in the response side and in the training side for many years.
All right, thank you, David. And lastly, Kevin Shea. Kevin, would you take a minute to introduce yourself, please, and your interest in the topic?
Sure. It's a topic I'm very interested and passionate about. I was a volunteer fireman on Long Island when I was a kid and worked for a utility company. Then I got hired, I think I was 24 when I got hired by FDNY. Stayed there till I had to retire early from an accident. And like many of you, passionate about the field. So I had a part-time job while I was a fireman in the city, working, teaching for the Suffolk County Fire Academy, teach some for the state, and teaching for private companies. And then when I had to retire before I wanted to, I just went into the full-time training for other companies. And I worked both with, well, I guess more than both, several different organizations, mostly volunteers, some professional, also military and other first responders. And I see certain patterns through the training. There's what I would like. I mean, I wish the whole world was technician level and everything. I know I'm not smart enough to be that guy. I'm a big proponent on back to basics. I think basics get us through everything. And I think as stresses come on the volunteer fire service, from what I've seen, it's almost like we're asking too much of them. Take on a specialty. I was not a hazmat guy. I did a few months detail to hazmat and FDNY, but I wasn't on my way to I was on my way to a rescue company. So if you have a volunteer department and you have engine company, truck company, EMS work, now you're going to throw technical rescue onto it, or a specialty like hazmat. And the volunteer firefighters act professionally. So I won't say professional to volunteer. I'll say paid to volunteer. It was easy for me to do all these things when I was paid. It was my career. How much are we asking of the volunteers? We're already doing a tremendous amount. And how can I change my curriculum that it doesn't take, I don't want to say as much training, where I can overlap my training, keep it to basic, keep everybody operations level with maybe a technician or two leading a team. I think this is, I don't have the answer for all these things, but I think it's a discussion I'd like to have with everybody here and try and find some solutions, how we can stay effective, but keep the amount of training reasonable that the guys and girls can do it.
Okay. And Maggie, could you put the poll results back up, please, if possible? And if not, if you could just repeat them. Oh, there they are. So we have 49 participants on the call today and 100% answered. So thanks so much for that, folks. 28% of you rated yourself at the awareness level, 39% at the operation, 28% at technician. Interesting. We've got even numbers, awareness and technician, and 6% otherwise. Thank you, Maggie. You can take that down. And at this next part, I'd like to ask one more, invite you to fill out one more poll. And Maggie, if you could put up the second poll, please. And this poll is asking, when did you take your last rescue training class? Was it 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, or other? So just be interested to see how current you've been attending rescue training, because that may have a lot to do with some of the perspectives and the currency of some of the topics that we're going to be mentioning. And while they're completing that, I'd like to ask David Rhodes. David, from your observation, what are two things that are challenges for the volunteer fire service and trying to have quality standards-based rescue training?
It's probably not just the volunteer fire service, but it's time. If you look at each one of the technical rescue disciplines, and when I was in special operations, we basically managed 5 different disciplines. And each one of them to get to technician was 40 to 80 hours a piece initial training. And then you had the yearly training requirements to keep up. Same with industry. When they're having to have an on-site factory type response team. So finding the time to stay proficient in all the technical rescue disciplines is nearly a full-time job. And then if you add in something like a dive rescue team or something to your special ops, then that's a whole nother level. I'm talking about rope, confined space, collapse, and trench. Those are sort of the basic ones. We did have water rescue in there too. But that was the biggest challenge for us, is just finding the time to get the people certified on the front end. And once you make that investment, then the constant replacement of turnover to replace those team members, and then just the maintenance training, keeping them proficient. So that was the other one. The second one would be the equipment itself. It's equipment that needs to be tested. It needs to be inspected regularly. And, without the support of a logistics section in your special ops force, then somebody has to do that. And there has to be a system set up to get that done, at least on a monthly basis. So as with most stuff, I think time is the biggest factor.
Time and equipment. And Kevin Reardon, Marshall Reardon, I'd like to go over to you, because you mentioned in Ohio the concern about the volunteers and having an adequate supply of volunteers. So what David highlighted, the time required and the equipment required, how do you see that impacting what your fear is in Ohio in recruiting volunteers?
Well, look at what it takes to be a volunteer. What I tell people when I'm talking to policymakers, because that's a big piece of this, is to become a volunteer in Ohio, you got to have training, basic training, 36 hours. Oddly enough, same course I took in 1978 when I became a volunteer for about a minute. Got to have training. Recertification requirements, 54 hours over 3 years, not daunting. Some places you got to pay for the training yourself. In Ohio, that can be $500 to $1,500. Some place you got to buy your own turnout gear, another $3,000 to $4,000. Then we're going to make you leave your family, your friends, go help some in your community, and come back. And on a bad day, you might get killed. How do you make that attractive? But that's the reality of being a volunteer. So when we look at responses for volunteers in Ohio, a garage fire might take, in the rural areas of Ohio, might take 4 or 5 different volunteer departments to get 4 or 5 people there. So that's just for garage fire. So when you apply that over to the rescue or technical rescue side, it's even more daunting. Like David said, there's some real challenges there. One of the things we identified in the governor's task force report on the volunteer fire service last year was funding for training. Like every other fire department budget, full-time or volunteer, when the money's tight, training always gets cut. Training and fire prevention always gets cut. So what we did with the volunteer fire service in Ohio is right now, for well into the future, at least my plan is, all training for volunteers in Ohio will be free through the Ohio Fire Academy. Now, we have a lot of on-campus courses here, but we've got over 40 different online courses that volunteers can take. And we, oddly enough, in our recruit class right now, have 2 volunteer firefighters from Southeast Ohio that are taking advantage of that. They're spending 10 weeks with us and another 6 on top of that to get their EMT training, all paid for free. They're walking out of here with firefighter 1 and 2 and EMT training. Didn't cost them a dime. We pick up their meals, their books, room and board, all of that. And that's one important piece. So we're hoping to really get that message out that if you want training as a volunteer, we can do it. And that includes the technical rescue training. If we can figure out those challenges on how you deliver a program like that to a volunteer fire department.
All right. And Kevin Shea, you and I talked the other day, And a kind of a follow-up to this is the currency of your skills and maintaining your skills. So we just talked about the challenge of the time and the challenge of equipment, and then the challenge of funding it for the volunteers and making it fit within their lifestyle. But can you talk about the need for rescue training skills to be kept current and frequent?
Sure. And you know, this is just my opinion on this stuff. Everybody's got an opinion. So some people might disagree with how I feel about it, but it's only what I've experienced or what I've seen. If you take like one of the disciplines that we're all familiar with would be rope, right? And you know, the guys and girls want to be technician level. And let's say you're even just own a small training company. You know how much equipment I have to buy to do that dual track high line, you know, that they're never going to do. I used to not be a proponent of it. And then you run the high line a few times. I don't even know what a Kootenai carriage costs anymore. You run it a few times, you're like, we're never going to do this. Why are we doing it? But I see all the different skill sets that need to go in to make this operate. So I'm like, you know what? It's a great drill. It's great, but realistically, are they ever going to do it? Probably never, but a great drill. Now take that aside, take that apart and say, what about 2 months, 6 months after you give the class? I went through this with the Air National Guard. We had a big contract, taught all the Air National Guard several dozen years ago throughout the country. And the program went on for a couple of years. Spec Rescue had it. It was an excellent program. The guys come back, they can't remember how to do it. You know, they came back the following year, it was gone. And you had people of all different skill sets to begin with, took the same course. The highlight was over. So that's why it made a big impression on me. The technician level, you're going to need a guy technician to run a job, to run in a rescue. But I don't need, and it's unrealistic to think, like David, you said 4 or 5 disciplines. I think I was saying 7 now. I still counting vehicle as a discipline. And we used to group man versus machine. There's a catchy title, but machinery rescue with vehicle. I don't know why. Maybe they thought metal was metal. The two have nothing to do with each other. So now recently, that's last few years, that's a separate discipline. I'm going down. If I count Swift Water, I believe there's 7 disciplines now. How are you going to be technician level, especially if you're a volunteer and you have another career? How are you going to be technician level in 7 disciplines? You're not. So back to rope. Rope is an extremely perishable skill. And for myself, and I'm no better than the next guy. I'm Joe Average. Just this is what I do. If I don't do it repeatedly, I'm going to forget it, get sloppy, or cut a corner. So my wife jokes with me, if you come over my house, my fishing kayaks are hanging with all different types of mechanical advantage systems that make no sense. It looks like the girls used to play, what was it, cat's cradle, and the string all over the place. I'm lifting up my goats in a harness to trim their hooves. You look like a moron. It's a joke with my friends. That is the only way I can stay proficient. I have to do this stuff all the time. So some of the disciplines will get repeated a lot. Confined space and rope or common need. Industry needs it. Like David, you know, if you're teaching in private industry, they don't want to do it. OSHA makes them do it, you know? So bingo, a lot of rope work, a lot of confined space work. And a guy's in an average place can stay proficient. How are you going to stay proficient with trench rescue? You could build those concrete tunnels, you know, the permanent form, so you could practice with your whalers and your shoring, or what have you, your panels, but the trench isn't live. It's not moving dirt. It's not possible to take the backhoe out and dig a trench all the time. You don't have the air, you don't have the space, you don't have the time, you're not gonna have the manpower. So I really am happy when I can get the members interested in a strong operations level. And I think we had talked about this, Ken. You had mentioned, what should a chief operating a job do? If you're going to take on, again, look, brothers and sisters, just my opinion. I don't want anybody throwing darts at the Kevin Shea dartboard for saying this, you know. But if you're going to run a team, you're a leader, and you're going to order them into a situation, you definitely don't have to be, technician level. You don't even have to be current operations level, but you have to have done this. You have to be at least operations in your past, not too far back. Otherwise, how do I know how long the members can work in this gear? How do I know how long they can be on air before I have to switch them out in a confined space? Because they won't come off on their own. And I know that they're getting foggy, they're not performing.
Mhm.
So for the leader, everybody if your department's got one of these teams and you've decided to take this responsibility on, I feel it's your responsibility to at least have been operations level for a while, even if it's just training and you're not doing it, to understand what's involved, what you have to do, what you're asking your members to do, Also, with some of the tech rescue, be careful what you wish for. You might get it. If you can't fulfill some of these obligations, maybe you don't want to take all of them on.
Mhm.
You take them on, you're the team. State trooper gets some call, he calls the dispatcher, whatever. Every state's different. They say you got to go. Well, you better perform. Is going to be nobody else coming. Specialty teams are becoming more
Mhm.
difficult to fund, like we said, training, equipment, new members. I wish everybody could do everything. But realistically, if I had a small group and I had target hazards like that in my department, everybody I could get through a really strong operations level skill set that they maintain on drills at the firehouse, get one or two for each discipline technician level to run the jobs and maybe to run the drills. And you're going to have to start to do your drills, overlap your drills. I think that when we train, we get too locked into, I'm here for a rope class. It's just rope. I'm here for, trench rescue. It's just trench.
Mhm.
Well, what the car goes into the trench at the construction site, and you have to access by rope, or maybe you guys can climb down, but you got to get the person into their sked and get them out with rope. I would say overlapping as best you can at your drills, different disciplines that you're going to take on, because the real world throws them all to you in a package at once.
Mhm.
If everything was good, they wouldn't call us.
So I'd like to make a little shift here. We've been talking about the impact upon the department and some of the needs. And Kevin Shea just gave some great examples of the need to keep your training current and how to overlap skills, because a lot of true rescue incidents require that skill overlap. So I'd like to introduce the role standards play in defining what is expected of a competent rescuer, but also as a guide for the training that needs to be conducted at the department level, as well as the skills that have to be achieved and performed. So, David Rhodes, I'd like to ask you to start with a little bit of an overview. And just for the folks who are on the webinar, I'm going to be talking about NFPA standards, National Fire Protection Association standards. If you're unfamiliar with them, they are the standards developer, one of many standards developer, but they do have a library of standards that address the needs of the fire service. And they have a line of standards that talk about equipment and competencies, and a line of standards that talk about qualifications and job performance requirements. So we're going to talk a little bit about those and their implication in the rescue training space, and some of the good and the bad about having the NFPA standards as that guidance. So David, if you could kick off that part of the conversation, please.
Yeah, well, obviously the NFPA standard is the first place to go to see what you're getting yourself into and what's required, and it's all laid out in the technical rescue standard. And then you've got to add the OSHA standard on top of that, and the more you teach that, the more those numbers stick in your head. So if anybody ever says the word OSHA to me, I immediately think 1910 for some reason.
Mhm.
I can't always remember the rescue ones for NFPA because I think they've changed and combined a few times. But what are they? Is it 16 something? I can't remember.
So it's NFPA 2500 is now the
25 is now.
consolidated
Okay.
standard, and that took 1670, 1858, and 1983. But 1006, which is the professional qualifications, that is still a standalone standard. But those
Yeah.
other three are now combined under NFPA 2500.
So if anybody's looking to get into the rescue business, you got to start there to see what's required to build your system. And just as Kevin said, you need to pick which level you're going to build your team to. And when you're building this, whether you have some free training, some training you're going to have to pay for, that's going to help you build the budget and identify your resources, because these things require a lot of front end loading. And after 9/11, there was tons of grant money for all of this. So a lot of people started teams because the money was flowing. But it's just like buying a house. You might be able to afford the house, but can you afford the maintenance on the house? And so if you don't budget and you don't have a long-term plan, then this becomes another one of those fire department once and done where we get 10 people trained up to rope rescue or confined space. And then 2-3 years down the road, we don't really have a system. We had a class 2 or 3 years ago. And so you have to build your system based on the standard and be able to maintain that. So if it's going to cost you a initial $50,000-$100,000 to get everybody trained to the level you want, then you need to know that it's probably going to cost you 30 just to maintain those initial people. And I'm just using numbers as an example, because maybe you're talking 2 people and it's totally different. But if you're looking at a team, those numbers are going to be big. And obviously, as Kevin said, if there's free resources, you build that. But I think the standard is the first place to start to build your plan, and then you work off of that to see what level of service you can provide for your community. You got to go to the community. What does the community expect? If you've got big industry in your area and they expect that you're confined space and rope, then maybe you can get them to pay for it, because I guarantee you every one of them lists the fire department as the emergency backup, whether they're trained or not. They're going to put that on the permit. We have that all the time. We even in the paid departments, they'll list, a certain unit in the fire department as their backup, and that unit's on calls, all day long and not available for what the standard requires. So that's it. Start there and build your plan off the standard.
And just for folks on the attending this with the NFPA standards, that's also what drives the curriculum that the major publishers use, the Jones and Bartlett, the IFSTA, the Clarion and Fire Engineering, and others who are developing training and curriculum for the fire service in rescue. Very often they will look at like standard 1006 and look at the job performance requirements, and then develop curriculum that addresses those needs. And as David just said, your first step is to look, if we want to go down this path, what are we asking individuals to do? Then you define the level of competency they have, and then you find a curriculum that aligns with that, and you start building out that system. Kevin Reardon, you had talked about trying to work with policymakers to get funding. So what David Rhodes just explained about approaching rescue training, standards-based rescue training as a system, and having a sustainable process and the cost that's involved. In your experience, is that something that policymakers are open to, or is that a big lift?
That's a huge lift. What we've seen with the task force report that we did on volunteer fire service was, as long as you pick up your phone and dial 911 and somebody shows up, everything's great. Everything's good. When you start to talk about how volunteer fire departments are funded, most states take the view that, oh, that's all local. That's local. We don't do this. We don't do that. Well, I would contend that when the locals fail at fire protection, the state fails. So I'm trying to build the argument for there is a role for the state of Ohio in this case to get involved with funding the volunteer fire service in some way, shape, or form. We have about $10 million worth of grant programs in Ohio that are geared specifically toward the volunteer fire service and small departments. That's a start. But the bigger issue is getting the issues before the legislators. Nothing happens without a legislative change. So when we talk about creating a benefit system or a pension system for volunteers, that doesn't happen without the legislators' support. And right now in the political climate, it's hard to get their attention. I've got a governor that's completely supportive of anything and everything we want to do, but he's only one. I've got an entire Senate and an entire body of House reps. They have to chime in as well. And it's hard to get their attention right now. They don't see the need. So that's one of my missions this year is to meet with them, make them aware of what's going on in their community. In Ohio, 70% of our 1,178 fire departments are volunteer. So you can't drive more than 5 minutes from any urban area in Ohio, and you're going to be served by a volunteer fire department. My old department, the City of Columbus, my home for 33 and a half years. 10 minutes away from the city, it's a volunteer fire department you're going to get served by. People don't know that. And the good of that is the volunteers are delivering the same quality of services as some of these big time, full career departments are. The public doesn't see the difference. They just want help. But the other thing I'm asking volunteers to do is, hey, help yourself. Go out and meet with your state rep, meet with your state senator. Make sure your trustees understand what's going on. I'll go out and meet with them and draw them a picture if I have to of how this funding isn't working in Ohio. We've got to overcome that. Property tax crisis is everywhere. In Ohio, we had some counties that had their property taxes go up 40% in 1 year. That's devastating. I've got one fire chief came to me a while ago, a couple months ago, and said he actually had a citizen and his wife come up to him and say, hey, chief, we love what you're doing. We love the volunteer fire department, but we can't afford to vote for your levy. That's never happened to us before, but it's going to happen more and more. So we've got to get on top of this and get the legislators involved up front, get their attention, and then keep their focus somehow.
All right. And just one of the NVFC is a national membership organization, but it has a state structure as well. And as Kevin was just explaining in Ohio, where he's advocating, when you go up to the executive level and the legislative levels of state government, if you're affiliated with a membership organization or you have a structure that can amplify the voice of the local fire departments, that's a powerful medium and can work with folks like Kevin to bring that forward. So just wanted to plug NVFC for the work it does in advocating for the needs of the volunteer fire service. Kevin Shea, you go out and you teach and you know the standards, but some folks might say, as you're trying to teach them, the standards are crap and we don't need to follow them. How do you address that in a skill where having standards is a good thing, but people may think it restricts them in the real world from doing so? Kevin Shea, how do you respond to that?
Well, I might have been one of the guys that wasn't thrilled with some of the standards, but I see their value. I mean, absolutely. You got to have something to go by, especially if you're starting a new team. Where do you start? What do you do, right? So I discussed this with everybody, OSHA and NFPA. And again, one more time, my disclaimer, David, this is just my opinion. So you got OSHA and you got NFPA, right? And I started writing some stuff about them, and I went into OSHA, NFPA, NIOSH. I didn't understand what the differences were. And I learned about their history when they started, back in the 30s, late 30s, it was starting with workplace safety, and NFPA was insurance companies, and we know all this stuff. But what does that mean? And NIOSH is really just the reporting agency. They bring the statistics in and they don't make the decisions, but they record, incidents and what happened. So you look at this, you're like, all right, what am I going to do? You have to abide by OSHA. So the way I teach it, and please, you guys can correct me, because this is a lot of this is opinion, but OSHA is the law, NFPA is a suggestion. NFPA does not have an enforcement agency, and I don't believe it does. Well, OSHA does, right? So occasionally you'll find conflicts. And before I teach, or let's say before, and I have a partner, thank God, that does these curriculums. I'm presenting, he's writing them all up and we change them. My partner, John Campbell, is a chief of Helena Fire Department here in Montana, and he's great at this. But even those curriculums need to be checked constantly. So we know NFPA every couple of years it comes out, right? 5 years, new standard. OSHA doesn't come out on a schedule like that. They make a change, they make a change. So you have to stay on top of the stuff to stay current. Now, if something comes up and you're conflicting with OSHA, if there's a problem, you're on your own. You can't really justify it. Like I said, it's the law. But there's a lot of gray areas in the OSHA. This is why you really have to own your skill set. You can't just depend on OSHA or on NFPA. And I don't have it off the top of my head, but it used to be a certain thing was operations level and certain was it was never awareness for making a confined space rescue. All of a sudden, I can't remember if it was awareness or operations. They said if it was line of sight, you could make the rescue. Well, what's line of sight? Is it 10 foot down? Is it 100 foot down? Is it technician level rope work, but still line of sight? So you really got to hammer this stuff, which is an area where I could be guilty because I'm more like, get it done. What can I do? Get it, make it happen. Ask for forgiveness type thing instead of permission. That's not going to fly if you're in court. So you really have to check your curriculum, which is not hard to do. You make up a drill at home. It's not hard to do with the OSHA. The NFPA, you can violate it if, I would say violate it. Oh, that's the wrong word. You can do something that doesn't necessarily abide by NFPA, but you better have a really good reason. You go to court, something goes wrong. The attorneys are not firefighters. They're going to go right to NFPA and right to OSHA. Now, OSHA is the law. You can't vary from that. I can see areas where we bend and not go by NFPA, but the NFPA is an excellent standard unless you're in a spot where you really have to do something. But you're proficient, you know your job, you know why the NFPA standard, let's say, wouldn't work for you, and you go. An example would be positive and negative example with rope rescue. Those roof rope rescues, I just did another one in FDNY, a triple roof rope rescue a month ago. And I listened to the kid giving the interview afterwards, the probie. It was fantastic. And there's the chief Hodgins looking at the guy. Is probably, it was like a proud dad looking at his son. We violated everything. That's the way it is. No second attachment, right? No safety line. Basically, when you're off the ground, you're supposed to have 2 points of attachment, right? So if I'm going down a ladder, down into a manhole, well, one is the ladder itself, 1 point of attachment. The other would be the safety line on my back. So here you are doing this roof rope, no second line. The victim's not attached to you. You're holding him. He's holding you. The OSHA, NFPA, disaster. But they're confident and competent enough to say, we only use this for one situation. We know there were no other options. I doubt you're going to find an attorney that's going to have more knowledge than the people doing this. They're professional and they had a reason what they did. So there's your NFPA. OSHA is the law. But again, when I'm teaching the class, I could go through what they need. I do it in a PowerPoint presentation. You go into a confined space class, operations, technician level, a couple of days to a week, depending on what we're teaching. PowerPoint's a couple of hours. All the standards are covered, NFPA is covered, OSHA's covered, and then we get out to work. But you have to remember that the world is not reading the OSHA. And David, you joked about it, and you see it in private industry. They're putting down, call 911. Who's your rescuer? It says right in the OSHA standard, and I got it drilled 1910, 146. That's all I remember too. I don't know the others, you know. I think it was 147 is just about lockout tagout. Who pays attention to that? It's a padlock, dude. Get a life. But this is what these OSHA standards are. All right, I'm going to do it. Now you get out the real world. That dude's not doing what he's supposed to do. There's no due diligence. They're not contacting the fire department and saying, are you a proficient confined space team? Will you stand by or be within a reasonable amount of time when I'm doing a permit required entry? There's all these rules. Well, dude, the only people following it's going to be you. They're not rarely following it. Petroleum industry is a breath of fresh air. I guess they got so much bad press. They follow it. And however, let's say Exxon works in the US, they go other parts of the world, they still have that standard. You get into other companies, they'll operate one way in New York, one way in Montana. I've seen this before. So, you know, like I said, just remember that OSHA is the law. NFPA is a suggestion, but if you don't have a much better reason, then NFPA should be your law. And understand too that because you're following it, private industry hit or miss if they're going to follow it. I think that's where I'd leave that, Ken.
And Kevin, I would just like to take the example you used of the roof rescue that the Proby and FDNY made. There was a
Yes.
very tragic event involving FDNY firefighters attempting to self-escape with a rope many
Yeah.
years ago, and the rope failed.
Yes.
And that led, and I want to use this as an example of the NFPA process, the tragic experience of that rope failing, which resulted, I believe, in fatal injuries to members of FDNY, was taken to the technical committee that develops the standards for rope at for NFPA. And they looked at this and they said, what happened? What went wrong? What can we do to ensure this does not happen again? So
Yes.
if you're in a rescue training or a rescue environment and you're looking for equipment and you find equipment that is NFPA compliant with an NFPA standard or certified to an NFPA standard, very often that's the reflection of a tragic event that happened
Yes.
where they discovered a gap in the standard, and the NFPA process brought that information in and actually changed the standard and created language so
Yes.
that the manufacturers of the product could then say, we've addressed that. So that's another benefit of the NFPA standards. David Rhodes, I'd like to kind of, as we look towards this last segment here before we get to see if we have some questions, the role of the leadership of an organization in addressing the needs for rescue training within the department. So David Rhodes, the role of the chief and the administration of the department in supporting rescue training. What's your thoughts on that? What role do they play? How can they support it? And what should they avoid doing to not be an obstacle to it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if we had all the answers to the leadership questions, then we'd all be rich and living on our yacht and giving out advice daily. But I mean, leadership's everything, right? It's like, if the leadership doesn't support it, it's not going to work, because there's not going to be buy-in into the system. So I think the key in this particular scenario is that the leadership has to support the plan, but also be the person that is also the realist that can look at the resources, and maybe they're the voice of reason, because maybe the organization comes and says, hey, you know, we've got 30 folks and we want to be technician level in all 7 disciplines. And, you know, that's the pipe dream. And what do they teach you? They're like, say yes more than you say no. But you have to be able to communicate to the members why that is or isn't a good idea. And you got to be able to draw it on the board and lay it out, and then negotiate back and forth with the members to come up with a satisfactory plan that can sustain itself. And that's the whole key. I've seen so many, we joked about it in our paid organization, is we always would refer to it as there was a secret room somewhere at headquarters that was like the last scene in the original Indiana Jones. when they, put the Ark of the Covenant in the warehouse, and it like went for miles of just artifacts. And it was like the secret closet of started and unfinished projects. And there's nothing worse than getting everybody's hopes up and starting something and then dropping the ball. So I think the leader's role is to set clear expectations, discuss that with the members, and then be the realist of what can actually be accomplished. And it's one of the things I always use is like, hey, man, I would love for us to be here, but why don't we just get started? Let's just get started and get a little momentum. And like back to this scenario, like let's get everybody to awareness first, so that at least we can recognize the hazards and know what we shouldn't do, like jump down in a manhole with no SCBA or no supplied air. Let's get everybody to that level, and then let's go to the next level, and let's take it, one bite at a time and do what we can. But don't ever set unrealistic expectations and set your team up for failure.
All right. Kevin Reardon, we're talking on the role of leadership here, and you engage with leadership of many volunteer departments as well as the state leadership. How do you see that interface between the local leadership and the state level leadership in trying to advance things like this and guide people to make reasonable investments in standards-based rescue training? And as David Rhodes just said, not going for the moon right off the bat, not training way beyond the need or the ability of the department to support it. How do you see that?
It's a huge disconnect on multiple levels. There's a disconnect at the local level with some fire departments and perhaps their township trustees, and with some of their residents. On the other end of that, you've got local elected officials at the state level that are far focused on other issues. And this is kind of like a little gnat flying around, go away and come back when we have time. We don't have any time. We've got volunteer departments that probably in the next 5 years, they're not going to exist in Ohio. They're just not. So along with that goes the capability for anything and everything. And technical rescue is going to be a pipe dream for most of these departments. I mean, they're focused on trying to get a basic response to a garage fire or a house fire. Response times just don't support too much other than the basics at the volunteer level. And they do it well. They do it great. But it's the structure of that system, that process itself, that is part of the problem. And, people tell me, well, you're a big city guy. You want everybody to be a full-time department. I'm like, no, because that's not the answer either. The answer is maybe instead of having a fire department that is, a half a mile away from yours, maybe join in Form 1, take advantage of multiple funding streams so that they can do other things. But right now, Ken, there's just a huge disconnect on multiple levels. And that's one of the problems we've got to take and work at. And I learned a long time ago, this is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. There's just so much there.
And on the funding, I know the Assistance to Firefighter grants do fund training and equipment. But I also know that the full-blown grant application can be a pretty big lift for a volunteer organization who may not have a trained grant writer or the resources. Well, the good news is the AFG folks with influence from NVFC and others recognize that, and they developed what's called micro grants. Each year under the AFG, there is a level of grant funding, and it's capped at, I think it's $75,000. It's in that range. And they've greatly reduced the amount of paperwork that's required to apply for that grant. It's a much simpler application process. And one of the interesting facts is there's not a lot of utilization of the micro grant, that some of the money that's been set aside in hopes that smaller organizations would access it, they're not taking advantage of it for whatever reason. So when we talk about funding, and a lot of folks will say there's AFG, but that's a big lift. I just want to bring to everyone's attention that AFG does have the micro grants, less paperwork, smaller amount of money, but designed to address the needs of smaller organizations like many volunteer fire departments are. Kevin Shea, you're in a unique position because you go out and you provide your training as a service, as a vendor. When you engage with the leadership of a department, Kevin, and they ask you or you do your assessment, what are you looking for in that leader to determine, do they really get what rescue is about? Or are they just going for the latest shiny object because they're reacting to pressure and they want to make people happy? What's your perspective on that?
Um, Obviously a firefighter and not a businessman. I think I've talked more departments out of classes than I've tried to sell. I think they don't understand what they're getting into. I think that the new shiny thing is something I have to battle with. When I talk to them, I explain what's involved, and it's like human nature. I wish there was a course in human nature, in psychology. Sometimes they'll ask for something. To get it's easy. The pool of instructors, the better instructors, I say is about 200, 220 of them in the country. And we share them, whether it's Roco, whether it's Spec Rescue, whether it's this company or that company. It's the same guys, a call from the same pool. They're not exclusive. We share a lot of information, which is wonderful. It serves the industry and serves the volunteer fire service. But I hear the same things all the time. They will I'll tell the guy or the girl, I tell the chief, look, this is what's involved. And this is the amount of training you're going to have to keep up to stay proficient. This is what you're going to have to do to, be effective in a year from now. That's like talking to children. They're all shaking their head, yes. And then I get there, nope. I come back. I liked what David had said. I try and promote this quite a bit. Was more Roco back in the 90s when I taught for them, did it and did well with it. Spec Rescue did it somewhat. Spec Rescue did more military, not as much. They did industry too, but Roco was down in the Louisiana and they had a heavy contacts with the oil industry. And I went several places that they had helped negotiate between the fire department and industry, whether it was a paper mill, a couple of paper mills we did. It just would come to the company and say, look, they hooked them up with the local volunteer fire department, and the company would outfit, pay, and train the volunteers for free. And the volunteers would have to commit to being there for permit required entries. So they weren't there all the time for every entry. If it was non-permit required, they didn't have to be on standby. But instead of paying a tremendous amount for a standby company to come in, that's a lot of money, that's expensive. Some paper mills would train like their security guards or certain members. A horn would go off, let's say, stop the conveyor belt. And these guys will all leave their station and they would be the fire brigade or the rescue brigade. But they couldn't keep it up. It was too expensive, they felt, to keep paying guys overtime to drill. The volunteers would do that on their drill nights and their drills. If it was Wednesday night and Sunday morning, they would drill and keep up proficiency. So it really was a win-win. OSHA was happy, the industry was happy, and the fire departments were happy. I tried to get that happening here in Montana, and the industry's not interested. A lot of them just don't abide by what the rules are. Like I said, when you're working, NFPA is a suggestion, OSHA is the law. When you're dealing with private industry, they think OSHA is a suggestion if they don't get caught. So I bring all this up to the chief before we even talk about if I'm going to come in and teach, because this is not like everybody else. This is a calling, not just my job. This is my passion. And I don't want to set anybody up to fail. I could, and same with the other guys are the same. The other training companies, it's the same. I could teach anybody to do this stuff. It's not rocket science, but it takes a lot of effort to stay proficient. And the higher level you go, whether it's awareness officer, technician, the higher the amount of training and drill you have to do. Now, if you think you're going to take on 3 or 4 disciplines at technician level, it's probably not going to happen.
Big lift. Yeah.
Yeah, can't do it.
Speaking of training, we had done a poll, and I'd like to share the results of the poll about when folks on the roundtable who are attending had done their most recent training. 34% of the attendees said they had done their most recent training within 6 months,
Mhm.
16% within a year, 18% within 2 years, and 32% other. So we have some folks who have been very involved in training, and that's great. So we're winding down. Two quick takeaways for folks who are on the call. With NFPA, the technical committees are open, and they're open in two ways. One, if you really have an interest, you can apply to be a member of the technical committee and be part of the discussion. The other way is all of their meetings are open to the public at any time, and many of them today are available via Zoom, so you can attend them remotely. And it's a process, and it takes a couple of years for the standard. But there's also, they publish the results of the standard, and you have the ability to look at the considerations for the changes that are about to be made and why they're going to be made. And you can online, using a form, submit your thoughts about whether you think that's a correct approach or an incorrect approach and for why. So NFPA as a standards developer is an open process, and everyone on this call has access to it. The other, we heard OSHA 1910 referenced several times today. The OSHA has proposed a major reorganization and revision of that standard. And that is now open for public comment. And I know NVFC has hosted a webinar on the proposed changes and the impact on the fire service. And we'll be submitting comments on behalf of its members. But if you read and see this standard, this proposed OSHA revision 1910 would have a big impact on all firefighters, career and volunteer. But the volunteer fire service, because of the issues we talked about today with funding, time management, having adequate resources of people to complete the needed tasks, potentially this revision would have a big impact on what's required for that. So I just share that with you. You might be seeing things discussed. You might see journal articles, magazine articles, presentations at conferences, and we'll just have to see. This is up for comment until the end of May, mid-May. Then the agency will review the comments and come up with a revised proposal, and then see if this is the time for this to be implemented or not. There were two questions that were asked. One was I referring to the Black Sunday incident at FDNY when I talked about the failure of
No.
the ropes? I'll be honest, I'm not. I think I was, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if that was the exact incident. Kevin Shea might know better than
I
I.
addressed that quickly. The Black Sunday, was not the change in the NFPA. The 1983 is when I believe the standard came out. And I try and be very careful when I talk about something with FDNY that my facts are accurate. The incident was not in 1983, I don't believe. I think it was either 1980 or 81, but it was basically firefighter Frisbee was at a window in a shaft, and he was cut off, and firefighter Fitzpatrick from Rescue 3 went over the roof on that roof rope rescue. He picked up firefighter Frisbee at the window, and as soon as he swung the extra weight off the window, the rope broke, and they fell down the shaft. One died immediately, one died on the way to the hospital, I believe. So that was firefighter Fitzpatrick from Rescue 3 and firefighter Frisbee. That's the 1983 standard. And just a side note too, on some of these standards, when there's emotions involved, and I could ask Kevin and David their opinion on this. In 1983, when that standard 1983, there's a 15-to-1 safety ratio with rope. It might be overkill. That's not what caused the accident. And we don't have that type of a safety buffer built into anything that we do. Nothing's, that stringent. So I didn't know if that would ever change. Doesn't matter to me if it does. But yeah, that was the incident. That's the Fitzpatrick and Frisbee. Black Sunday is a separate incident when the guys had to bail out the top floor, and they became more stringent with bailout and personal ropes, but it wasn't an NFPA change.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
And somebody asked the question, I think, let me just cursor up if I can. Did we discuss creating regional teams for suburban and rural areas? We've not discussed that today, but I think I could speak for Kevin Reardon for sure that in Ohio, as they look at trying to match need with resources, that certainly is something that is out there. And it's a great opportunity for those who are on the roundtable. If you're interested in participating in this level of operational response, but your department can't support it, look to see if there are regional teams that maybe you can take part in. That's a great opportunity. And folks, we're right up against the hour. I want to thank David Rhodes and Kevin Shea and Kevin Reardon for participating in today's panel discussion, and the NVFC for putting this together. And this will be posted. The recording of the webinar will be posted and available so you can view it afterwards. And thanks, everybody, and stay safe. And we'll see you at the next roundtable.
Thank you.
Bye.